Ghosts, angels, demons, fairies, vampires, werewolves. All those stories you heard as a kid. All those stories mom and dad said weren't true. For most people, that's all they are. Myth, legend. Occasionally people find there is something out there in the dark. Many years ago, I trained with the late Lou Gentili, one of the best known demonologists in the United States. When he died, he asked I continue his legacy. I've been continuing investigations since his death, but I also wanted to bring back his efforts to educate the public about what's really out there. Join us for a brand new YouTube series, The Paranormal Encyclopedia, with me, your host, Kevin Mears, demonologist and paranormal investigator, while we investigate what really goes bump in the night.
So, before you think this is all about doom and gloom, well, first of all, it is. Second of all, that is not entirely our purpose. We're here to entertain, we're here to tell you, and you're probably wondering who the hell I am. I'm not the demonologist. It's my job to ask questions, it's my job to be the skeptic. I've got some background in history, particularly about witches, but I'm here to hypothetically be your voice. I'm Drew. Welcome to Paranormal Encyclopedia.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of the Paranormal Encyclopedia. I'm your host, Kevin Mears. We have a guest on tonight, author John L. French. Unfortunately, there's something going on with the video on his end, so you're going to just be seeing Drew and myself. I will let Drew introduce himself, and then John, you go ahead and introduce yourself as well when he's done. Go ahead, Drew.
All right. Well, I'm Drew Zansky, the co-host. So, I've studied history, and that is my spiel. I'm sure you guys have heard this by now, so we'll get right to John.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. I'm John L. French. I'm a writer of various genres: crime fiction, pulp fiction, and paranormal fiction. My day job is with the Baltimore City Police Department in the crime lab. I work for the crime scene. I'm a supervisor in the crime scene unit.
Obviously, what brought me, John, to my attention is the fiction. It's not directly paranormal, but I find it interesting, so perhaps we'll get a little bit to the crime lab work as well, if that's okay with you, John.
Fine.
Okay, so as I had said in our emails, I got introduced to you through, a mutual friend, C.J. Henderson's work, but I want to ask, what got you started writing paranormal fiction?
Okay, when I started writing, I was writing straight mysteries. My first story was published in a small magazine called Hard Boiled, edited at the time by Gary Levisi. And at the same time, I had written I was reading C.J. Henderson's early works, and I had written to him through Gary, expressing how much I liked his stories. And we started writing back and forth, particularly when he found out what I did for a living. And in typical CJ fashion, it was, I can use a man like you. And I became his technical director as far as crime fiction was concerned. CJ always liked to bring out new writers, and so whenever he heard of an anthology coming out, he would see if I was interested. He got me writing horror fiction. First story was a vampire story, then there were zombie stories, and then he told me about this anthology called Eldritch Blue, which was to combine sex and the Lovecraft mythos. And I immediately thought of sex not as recreational, but as procreation, and came up with the story Out of the Blackness, which was the first Bianca Jones story.
Okay, I've read that one, I believe.
Yeah, it's the first one in Here There Be Monsters.
Yes.
and
It was like-
Bianca sort of came
Go
up, was born already in what didn't take much development. The minute I thought about her, there she was, 5 foot tall with about 6'3" of attitude.
And that's actually a really good description of the character. I didn't read that story first. I read a bunch of other ones in various collections. So getting Here There Be Monsters recently, it's like, oh, okay, that's how she got started in the paranormal. Because I'd always been curious. It's like, what was case one for her?
Right. And oddly enough, even though that story was accepted twice, it never saw print because maybe because Eldritch Blue was put out without the Bianca story. That was supposed to go into a collection called Elementary, My Dear Cthulhu, which was going to combine crime and the mythos, but that never got done. And then someone else was supposed to publish it, and I think his magazine fell through. So that really didn't see print until Here There Be Monsters came out.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Am I right in thinking that were there other Bianca Jones stories that came out before Here There Be Monsters, or?
The first one that came out was in an anthology by Die Monster Die, a small press publisher that was in Baltimore, and that was the 21 Doors.
Okay, that actually, reading that story, there's a, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but there's a subgenre of fiction on the internet called creepypastas. There's a very similar creepypasta to 21 Doors that the last guest we had on, a gentleman by the name of Lupus Creepus, actually tested out and posted to YouTube. So it was sort of interesting reading that and going, wait, I remember this.
Yeah, I combined Bianca with the Baltimore version of the Bloody Mary legend is Black Aggie.
Mm-hmm.
Basically the same thing, and then I threw in the Ouija board because the Baltimore Ouija Company was like the premier maker of Ouija boards at the time.
Yeah, I had noticed the three brought together like that.
Yeah,
and in fact, I heard...
21 Doors was a creepy game my daughter used to play with her friends at sleepovers.
Yeah, I kind of figured. I'd originally assumed... See, the thing with the creepypasta genre is you get some things that are made up by the person who wrote it, and then you have some like that are urban legends or something like that somebody puts online. I had originally assumed when I heard the story when Lupus tried it, okay, the original writer just made it up. I didn't know it was an actual urban legend until I saw it in the book. But, so I found it very interesting that you mentioned about Black Aggie in your story. So could you relate that story for listeners, for the people who aren't from Baltimore?
Okay, Black Aggie's a variation of the Bloody Mary legend. The basic thing is that if you stand in a darkened room at midnight looking into a mirror, and everywhere else but Baltimore you say Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, but in Baltimore you say Black Aggie, Black Aggie, Black Aggie, and certain horrible things are supposed to happen. You die, Black Aggie appears, you see a vision of hell, or something like that. The Black Aggie legend is, there was in the Pikesville Cemetery, which is north of Baltimore, there was a statue, I think it was called Sorrow, and the legend grew up around that statue in that there was a nurse who was taking care of an infant, and the infant died. The nurse was then blamed for the death and lynched by by the community, and that kind of got combined with the statue, and legends grew up around the statue that a virgin who crossed the grave at night would lose her virginity within 24 hours, thus making it a great place to take a date. If you supposedly a college student on a dare went to sleep on Black Aggie's grave, and never woke up. If a pregnant woman crossed the shadow of the statue crossed over, if a pregnant woman walked through the shadow of the statue, she would miscarry. Horrible things like that. It became such a unofficial tourist attraction. They actually had to move the statue out of the cemetery and place it into a small enclosed yard in Washington, D.C.
So was the grave actually for Black Aggie, or is that just some?
That was just the name that grew around. It was I don't quite remember who the grave was for.
I have that actually. Let's see. Thanks to the internet. Let's see. It's General Felix Agnes. In Druid Ridge Cemetery, Pikesville, Maryland. It was an unauthorized replica of a statue called Grief.
Grief. Yeah, I said sorrow. So.
Yeah. But I'd actually read the story years ago. In a collection of ghost stories. So it kind of stuck in my head, and then reading it's like, wait, Black Aggie, I remember that.
Now, was that collection called Don't Turn Off the Lights or Don't Turn on the Lights?
No, it was, I can't remember. It was either one of two things. I think it was called the Encyclopedia of Ghosts, which was just a ton of ghost stories. I think I read about it there, or it might have been in Ghosts in the Valley, which is a well-known book of series about ghost stories throughout the Delaware Valley, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. I don't remember for certain which one it was in. Do you know that particular? I mean, the book you mentioned. Do you know? I'm assuming that you read it there, or?
No, I just happened to remember. I may have read it there. Actually, my first exposure to Black Aggie was my father and a friend of his telling this very impressionable 10-year-old all these ghost stories about about what can happen in cemeteries.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in cemeteries.
On the east side of the city, within walking distance of the Greenmount Cemetery, which, among the people buried there are Johns Hopkins and John Wilkes Booth is buried there in an unmarked grave. It's a very large cemetery.
Wow.
And before it was fenced off, people in the neighborhood actually used to cross it as a, kind of take a shortcut. So my father grew up like in the shadow of the Greenmount Cemetery.
That's actually really cool. I lived just outside of a cemetery for a semester in college. That was about as close as I've gotten to that. And no, it wasn't for the obvious reason. It was the cheapest housing I could find.
Quiet neighbors.
Yeah. Well, relatively speaking. My line of the work that aren't necessarily quiet. But, so, there's a lot of questions that writers tend to get. I know, and many of them that you guys aren't terribly fond of, so I want to avoid those. So let me ask this instead. What's your favorite of your Bianca Jones stories?
My favorite Bianca Jones... I'll tell you, there's one that's... I'm waiting for Time and Space magazine to print it. It's called Beast in Show. It's takes place in Baltimore at a like one of these nationwide dog shows, and there's a werewolf who travels with the dog show.
Sounds right up your alley, Drew. Drew is our resident werewolf expert.
Yeah, well, in this one, basically, Bianca, being Bianca, threatens, if worse comes to worse, she'll give orders for every dog in the city to be shot down, starting with the poodles. Why the poodles? I don't like poodles.
That seems like an order she would give.
Right, you know. That, and there's another one. It will be, I mean, I've got a new collection coming out. I hope, you know, I can't say too much because I haven't confirmed it with the publisher yet, but in it there's a story called A Choice of Damnations, which Pat and I, we worked together on a limited edition flip book, a Bianca Jones story on my side, and then you flip it over, and it's a story of Pat's featuring Moni, his graveyard angel. Graveyard angel is a spirit that watches over graves and takes action if the grave is somehow disturbed or desecrated. It's probably the scariest Bianca story I've ever written, and there's nothing supernatural about it.
I'm familiar with Moni, having read a lot of. For those who don't know and weren't privy to the earlier conversation we were having, Patrick Thomas is another very good writer that John's worked with several times. We'll be having him on later in the month, actually, so we can get him to talk a little more about Moni.